This is going to be a continuation of my series of videos where I'm going over the divine names of Dionysius the Areopagite, where I give relatively short yet hopefully informative reflections on each chapter of the work, because it's such an overwhelmingly influential text on really the entirety of the Christian intellectual and spiritual tradition up and down the centuries, as we talked about in my last video. Now, in that last installment, the link to which I provided in the description, I ended with a quote that is found at the beginning of the chapter, of chapter 2, that we're going to go over in this installment. And I'll just go over it again here because it really gets to the heart of the spirit of this whole chapter, and indeed, really the entire treatise as a whole. And that quote is the following, quote, "All the names appropriate to God are praised regarding the whole, entire, full, and complete divinity, rather than any part of it. And they all refer indivisibly, absolutely, unreservedly, and totally to God in his entirety," unquote. Now, why do I think this phrase is so illuminative? Well, it speaks remarkably to the Dionysian interpretation of one of the core doctrines concerning the one God, and that is, of course, divine simplicity. This is, I think, the key trademark of classical theism, and is the principal distinguishing factor that sets it apart from the other variant of theistic personalism, which is a distinction that obviously cuts to the core, the very identity of this YouTube channel. Now, what Dionysius is saying here is that whatever name we predicate of God, save the incommunicable names which designate the persons of the Trinity, they refer to God not simply in part or even in an all-pervading aspect of him, but each one in their own way corresponds to the wholeness of the divinity in its absolute totality. Thus, each divine name, whether it be wisdom or power or goodness or being for Dionysius, these do not correspond to distinct super perfections that all exist alongside each other within the divine essence. That this is ruled out is easily proved by how this phrase is meticulously worded to avoid precisely this conclusion. If each divine name merely referred to an individuated super perfection in the divine essence, even an infinite super perfection, then it would of necessity relate to the other perfections in an exclusionary manner, thus introducing composition and division into the Godhead. So in other words, God's goodness, that aspect of God which is good, would have an opposition to, would have contrariety with the other aspect of God, which is, say, wise. So there would be sort of a mutual exclusivity of attributes. Not that the attributes would be contradictory to one another, but they would rule each other out in the precise aspect in which they would be actualized within God. Now, this is precisely the result that Dionysius wants to avoid. He doesn't want to establish a mutually referential relationship between the manifold perfections that we experience as created beings and the divine perfection, which is ineffably transcendent. Indeed, as to use Dionysius's favorite word, super essential. God, given his infinitude, does not stand in a determinate relationship to finite, fragmented, creaturely being, and as a result of this, he infinitely transcends each created fragment of finite being. And this is a theme we're going to be discussing throughout this entire video. It might almost sound repetitive, but it is a theme. Really, the divine names itself is repetitive. It kind of drags on the same themes and concepts, but always in a way that tries to bring new light to the same ideas. Now, because of this total transcendence, insofar as each name derived from creaturely perfections can be said to reflect the divinity, each name will reflect the divinity in its absolutely simple entirety. according to its own limited finite mode, of course. It is this relationship between divine transcendence and divine immanence that lies at the central core of this whole treatise and this whole theology. It's only because of this affirmation of divine simplicity that the three persons of the Trinity, which are truly distinct, can be praised nonetheless by the same divine names in utterly the same and unqualified manner, implying not even a shadow of inequality or disproportion between them. It's precisely the simplicity of God that protects the consubstantiality of the divine persons, for without it, the persons would simply partake of a multiplicity of divine perfections in a participatory fashion, and this would transform the persons sort of into a confederacy of participants in a common, composed nature. Now, this is just to underscore and emphasize the importance of divine unity, which for Dionysius must subsist in transcendental and undivided simplicity. It's also precisely by virtue of this simplicity that Dionysius can say that God is simultaneously beyond every name, even as he can be identified by each and every one of them. Because he is not composed of a multiplicity of constitutive perfections, but instead hovers above them all in infinite transcendence, his essence does not determinately answer to the content of any name that we derive from creatures, and thus in his very inner being, he must be praised as utterly and even infinitely beyond any name that we predicate of him. Yet, by this very fact, it also follows that he is fully and intimately present in all things, innermostly. Because he is utterly uncompounded, he cannot only be partially present in something, but he must be present in it according to the wholeness of his entire divinity. What accounts for the diversification of things, therefore, is in the creature. It's from the creaturely side, which in its finitude reflects the superessential divinity in an imperfect manner, and therefore each created perfection can, in its own way, reflect God in his undivided wholeness. And because of this simplicity, each finite reflection is in its own way complete and without blemish, even as there is a hierarchy of perfections according to how closely they mirror the divine being. Now, here I think it's appropriate to introduce, at least in a very cursory way for now, a central Dionysian concept that is pivotal to understanding his theology, and that would be the triplex via, or the triple way, which breaks into the way of negation, the way of causality, and the way of eminence. Now, these three ways of naming and predicating correspond to the three ways in which predicating a divine name of God actually corresponds to him, because they do not by any means all correspond to God in the same way. And indeed, it may be inappropriate to conflate or interchange them. Let's deal here first, though, with negation. As I'm sure a lot of you know, for St. Thomas Aquinas, we only ascend to knowledge of God from the standpoint of creatures. And for this reason, we can't have immediate and direct knowledge of God as he is in himself, because the perfections that we abstract from creatures are all limited and finite. Now, this is no different for Dionysius, and in many ways, this is much more emphasized. Because God is superessential and wholly beyond the created, fragmented, and finite order, no perfection that the intellect abstracts from creation can directly map onto God as he is in himself, because God, in his superessentiality, infinitely transcends that which is not God. And so there is, in fact, an infinite gulf between God and that which is not God. And for that reason, the most accurate knowledge of God is necessarily going to be negative. It is going to be accomplished through the removal of all perfections from him, a plunging of the mind into the abyss of utter darkness. And he uses this imagery of darkness quite a bit. But this is not because God lacks any of these perfections, but rather because, as Dionysius says, these perfections, quote, concern a denial in the sense of superabundance, unquote. Yet we also know that God is the cause of all things as creator. Thus, it is not sufficient for the human mind merely to, out of reverence for divine transcendence, to remove all creaturely perfections from him, We must recognize this removal as the most accurate means of predication, since we do not have direct knowledge of God as he is in himself, but we do know that what we are removing from him is caused by him. And by virtue of this causality, we must also, paradoxically, predicate of him the names that we just removed. And what's more, and this gets to the third way of eminence, the perfections that we predicate of him exist primarily in God, in their ontological fullness. Now, why is this? It stems from a metaphysical principle presupposed by Dionysius, namely, that effects necessarily resemble their causes. And since God is the cause of these created perfections, they must reflect him in their own limited mode of being. And not only reflect him, but because of his simplicity, each perfection reflects the totality of the divine being, yet imperfectly, given the finitude of the perfection known from our knowledge of creatures. Thus, when we predicate goodness or wisdom of God, goodness and wisdom are said to exist primarily in God and only secondarily in creatures. We'll break this triplex via down in more detail later in the series and return to this point in particular later in the video. So now that this Dionysian concept has been explored and laid out, to move on a bit, he next begins a fascinating discussion on what he's going to term the divine unity and the divine differentiations. So far, we've been hearing a lot about God's ineffable unity and superessential oneness, but as Christians who profess the triune mystery, there is also deep within God's unity a differentiation of persons, and it is this interplay between divine unity and divine differentiation that Dionysius devotes much of this chapter to. It's important to recognize that when he speaks of differentiation within the divinity himself, he is only talking about the internal processions of the Trinity. He's not talking about the diverse perfections that are common to the whole Godhead, because as we went over before, such names are predicated undividedly and wholly to the divine essence, to the whole divinity, which is shared in common by the persons. Thus, when he speaks of internal divine differentiation, he is speaking of the differentiation of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, what constitutes this differentiation for Dionysius? Well, while he does not speak in Thomistic or Augustinian terms per se with regard to relations of opposition, which is how St. Thomas and Augustine formulate the differentiation of the divine persons, the principal concept by which he seems to understand the concept of internal divine differentiation would be self-manifestation or divine self-revelation. Thus, within the inner activity of divine being, his superessential unity unfolds within himself in three differentiated hypostases, or self-manifesting points of divine light. I use that metaphor of light very much on purpose because this is an analogy that is a favorite of Dionysius, and in this very chapter, he uses the imagery of light in a very fascinating way to describe the inner divine differentiations or processions. He refers to three lamps in particular that each carry their own source of light. And these lamps, the individual lamps, these refer to, according to Dionysius, the divine differentiations, or in this case, of course, the divine persons, which are numerically distinct, individual subsisting hypostases, but in their substance, the light of the lamps is undifferentiated and utterly unified in such a way that it is impossible to set aside or distinguish between the light of one lamp from the light of another. Nevertheless, the individual subsistence of each lamp can be distinguished from one another. So while the metaphor is different from what you might find in, say, Augustine or Aquinas, who prefer more the psychological analogies, you nevertheless do retain the fact that in both systems, the three divine persons, by virtue of their consubstantiality, do not, in terms of their ontological identity, differ from their common substance. They have their common substance as their consubstantial shared identity. the divine nature itself. But they differ from each other in terms of the order by which this shared intra-divine life is self-possessed within the Godhead. It springs eternally from the fountainhead of the Father to the Son, in whom it is eternally received, and brought to eternal achievement in the Spirit, proceeding from the Father through the Son as by one principle and one spiration. Such are the internal divine differentiations, which are simply referred to by Dionysius as divine processions. And this self-same divine procession, being infinite and necessarily fulfilled within the inner life of God, who exists entirely beyond any finite limitation, even for Dionysius, beyond being itself, which is something we're going to get to later. This divine procession, this internal divine procession, in a totally freely chosen and gratuitous manner, also proceeds outward toward that which is not God, namely creation. And it is this outward procession, this outward energetic self-manifestation of God, that lays the foundation for the names by which he is predicated by creatures, and the differentiations that flow from this creaturely participation. Hence, there's a seamless continuity between the divine procession, whereby God is infinitely and internally self-manifested by the consubstantial Logos, or Word himself, and the divine procession, which corresponds to God's creative act. According to Dionysius in this chapter, the outward procession towards creatures stems from the same divine primordial wellspring that generates the Son from the Father by the Spirit, but in a manner completely and utterly free and out of nothing, and in a creative act common to the whole divinity. As Dionysius says, quote, "If differentiation can be said to apply to the generous procession of the undifferentiated divine unity, itself overflowing with goodness and dispensing itself toward multiplicity, then the things united even within this divine differentiation are the acts by which it irrepressibly imparts being, life, wisdom, and the other gifts of its all-creative goodness," unquote. This is again where I think discussion of the essence-energies distinction is quite relevant, and it is very revealing as to the true nature of Dionysian theology that he formulates his version of the distinction while referring specifically to the creative element of divine procession. That same divine procession, which is ineffably transcendent and beyond any capacity to subjugate to human knowledge, it does not hoard within itself, it does not hoard within its own depths divine perfection. In other words, God does not keep to himself, but he freely empties himself, proceeding outward towards creatures. And in this outward procession, the divine energy that, considered in and of itself as it is in itself, one and simple, manifests as multiple, perfective and creative activities that can be participated in by the creatures which proceed from this self-diffusive creative act of God. Now, to illustrate this a bit, Dionysius uses a very beautiful illustration of an imprint of a seal. Depending on the disposition of the wax, the seal will imprint itself diversely among different pieces of wax. The seal remains itself, however, one and simple, if you like. But the wax will receive that imprint of the seal differently depending on its shape and structure and disposition. Thus, the diversity of outward divine processions receives its multiplicity from the reception of divine activity in creatures. And it is that participatory reception that accounts for the differentiation of names. Now, this does not mean that the diversity of divine names is some kind of optical illusion, because they truly do stem from an activity that is properly God's. It is the self-manifestation of God that proceeds outward toward creatures. But this outward procession is received according to a diversification of finite, fragmented recipients. And as such, what is one and unified in the divine is received in creatures as multiple and diversified. Thus, the creature which participates in this divine energy is still engaging with God in a true and proper sense. This is not diminished. Yet God remains in himself superessential, utterly transcendent, and unapproachable. This unapproachability corresponds to God in his inner unity, which due to its infinitude bears no real relation to creatures, but insofar as God's internal procession does not close itself off inwardly within the divine essence, but proceeds outward toward creatures. The creature engages with this same divine energy, but received according to its own finite mode of being, which answers to the multiplication of the divine energy into energies. These multiple energies are not separate emanations from God. They are effects of the one divine creative act, which considered wholly by itself remains one and simple. But its reception in creatures is received according to the fragmented multiplicity proper to the creature. The seal remains itself, but the wax receives its stamp according to its own mode. This is in perfect continuity, I think, with the Thomistic maxim that which is received according to the mode of the recipient. As Dionysius says, quote, "When, for instance, we give the name God to that transcendent hiddenness, when we call it life, or being, or light, or word, what our minds lay hold of is in fact nothing other than certain activities apparent to us, activities which deify, cause being, bear life, and give wisdom," unquote. Now, the last concept I would like to discuss here, and this will close our discussion on Chapter 2, would be to elucidate further on the way of eminence, of that triplex via, that triple way that we talked about. Because Dionysius touches on it somewhat toward the end of this chapter. And that is, each perfection that is predicated of the divine as a name befitting him, while it is more accurate to deny it of him according to the way of negation, this does not rule out the fittingness of identifying God with what the created perfection signifies and presents to the mind. In fact, paradoxically, it makes it all the more fitting. And that is because, as we hinted earlier, his infinite transcendence of each created perfection means that he does not participate in any of those perfections, but rather those perfections are fragmented participations in the plenitude of his being. As Dionysius says, quote, "The fire which warms and burns is never itself said to be burnt or warmed," unquote. God is the very plenitude and infinite fullness of every perfection in its innermost purity and ontological intensity, but not in a fragmented and divided manner. In his transcendent simplicity, he hovers above each perfection as an ontological singularity, out of which the multiplicity of created perfections proceeds, and each one reflects that singularity in their own limited, finite, and fragmented manner. So I know that was a long video. I know that was a long discussion of Chapter 2, but I hope it was somewhat informative. If you want me to go into deeper explanation on anything, I'll be happy to do that in the comment section or what have you. Now that we're all in this sort of self-imposed quarantine for the time being, I'll be uploading more each week. I'm going to try to have one out every Wednesday. The next one I want to discuss, I already have the idea planned out, is going to be on this whole question of whether it's possible to contract a virus from receiving communion. I know a lot of Orthodox people have called me out on that recently, and I also want to discuss whether or not it is prudent for the church to suspend public masses, because I know there's a lot of discussion about that among a lot of trads on Catholic Twitter. You can just check my Twitter timeline to figure out where I stand on that, but I want to give a more in-depth explanation on that, hopefully this week or by Wednesday. So God bless, and I hope you enjoyed the video.